Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Andrea Lee, and I'm a Policy Analyst for the Corrections and Reentry Division at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. I'm joined today by Sarah Truckle, Senior Policy and Implementation Analyst for the Vermont Department of Corrections, and Connie Schutz, the Project Director for Recidivism-Reduction, also from the Vermont Department of Corrections. Before we begin, I have a couple technical notes. If you encounter any connection or audio problems during the webinar, please call WebEx Technical Support at 1-866-229-3239. We will also put that number in the chat box on your screen. Unfortunately, there are some connection issues we may not be able to resolve. However, we are recording today's webinar, and it'll be posted on our website within 2 weeks of today's date. We will start with a brief introduction and history of Vermont's project, then discuss the specifics of their policy development process, and finally talk through an in-practice example using Vermont's new case management directive. We have designated time at the end of the webinar to review questions and answers. At that time, please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box on your screen. And now a bit of background information on the National Reentry Resource Center. Technical assistance for Second Chance Act grants is provided by the NRRC, which is funded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance and managed by the Council of State Governments Justice Center. The NRRC has worked with more than 600 Second Chance Act grantees and provides individualized and targeted technical assistance, training, and distance learning opportunities. The NRRC is continually adding new content and resources to the website, and we send out a monthly newsletter that provides information about the latest research, funding opportunities, events, and other news related to the field of reentry. To sign up for the newsletter, please visit the link on your screen after today's webinar. The SCA Comprehensive Statewide Adult Recidivism Reduction Grant Program was uniquely designed by the Bureau of Justice Assistance to help executive branch policymakers and state corrections departments plan and implement system-wide reforms to reduce recidivism. As a recipient of the SRR grant, the Vermont DOC has emerged as a leader in the field. Through their integrated and comprehensive approaches to reentry, Vermont is implementing evidence-based practices and measuring their impact on recidivism reduction. There are currently 9 active SRR states. In addition to Vermont, the FY14 states include Georgia, Iowa, Illinois, and Minnesota. The FY16 states include Arizona, Connecticut, Indiana, and Nevada. The purpose of this webinar is to demonstrate how the Vermont DOC's policy development process successfully streamlines policy development into a continuous workflow from inception to signature. This process involves 4 primary steps that can be applied to any correctional department and will guide you towards organizing policies, codifying correctional practices, and streamlining documentation. And now I will turn it over to Connie Schutz, the Project Director for Recidivism Reduction for Vermont DOC.
Hi, everybody. So I want to just give a very brief overview over the various different pieces that Vermont has in place. We are aiming for an intentional and sustainable rollout. We hope to revise all the policies and procedures around risk tools, case planning, sanctions, and incentives, classification and supervision. So we have, since 2015, finalized 51 policies. We have 35 in draft. And just for context, those 35 will supersede 100 currently active rules and directives, and that will be a good thing for us. We are also doing core correctional practices training for state agencies and community providers. So, for example, we've done CJ Matters trainings to enable people to write more accurate case plans, and we have trained staff for a pilot in the adoption of criminal justice competencies. Our casework staff will be fully trained in EPICS by the end of the current calendar year. We started a pilot in the southern part of the state in last October that deals with improving reentry collaboration between state workers and other stakeholders. We are aiming to increase quality assurance and implementation fidelity of risk reduction programs by having trained staff on the correctional program checklist, and our first assessment is in process. We are working on collecting data to validate and norm the ORAS, and we have targeted programmings, including domestic violence. We also have a contract with the University of Cincinnati to develop and pilot web-based modules, both for our use and that of our stakeholders. So we will have, for example, an introduction to EPICS that will be made available to substance abuse and mental health services providers that work with our populations. Sarah?
Hello, everyone. I'm going to talk to you today specifically about Vermont's policy development process and why a streamlined policy development process is important. Correctional agencies are responsible for effectively communicating clear and concise policies and directives, particularly when seeking to cultivate system-wide buy-in from stakeholders, staff, and people returning to the community. Correctional policies cannot be based on subjective whim or opinions, but rather should be grounded in evidence-based practices that are proven to be effective. Vermont's streamlined policy development process is unique because it creates a step-by-step process for the entire policy development creation. It creates mechanisms for internal and external stakeholder feedback and provides for a public comment period, accounts for legal reviews, as well as union negotiations, and takes into consideration all other possible logistical and/or operational concerns. Vermont's policy development process is all electronic and therefore removes barriers to finalization and creates ready-to-implement policies that can be disseminated to staff in a timely manner. How did we create this process that constantly moves forward? We used an opt-in versus an opt-out approach. Vermont's policy development process, using this opt-in and opt-out versus opt-out approach to document reviews and participation, creates an expedited policy development process. At each review point, reviewers are given 2 weeks to review and provide feedback. If a reviewer fails to provide feedback, the process continues. This means that a document is not delayed or halted because of a staff person's failure to read it. To implement this successfully, the Policy Development Unit identified clear timelines for each phase, clear expectations for all staff, and followed through with keeping the policy moving forward. Over the next half hour, we will be reviewing Vermont's policy development process and its primary 4 phases. We will end the webinar with an in-practice example of how Vermont utilized the policy development process to write its case management directive. Where we started, we had a lot of delays in policy development. Vermont's policy development process was created in response to these significant delays. Specifically, we had policies that took years to go from drafting to signature. We had no tracking mechanism to understand where policies were in the development process. We did not have a review process for our current existing policies, so many were over 20 years old. There was no collaboration across the Department of Corrections or consistency in policy creation. We had no formalized process for how feedback was incorporated. There was no analysis conducted on existing policies during drafting, leading to policies that often conflicted with each other, and reviews were opinionated and stylistic and didn't necessarily stick to the expertise that was being sought. So we had a long way to come. So what are Vermont's 4 steps in creating an effective policy development process? Step 1. The first step of the policy development process is to identify the need for a new or revised policy and gain approval from the executive team to begin drafting. This is the preliminary phase, includes the creation of a work plan, which identifies anticipated timeframes for the policy development document based on the size and impact of the policy. Additionally, this phase also includes the identification of an internal stakeholder team, and in Vermont, this is called our policy development team, who will conduct an initial review of the draft. Key steps to this phase include the identification of the reasons behind the need for a new or revised policy, such as statute, case law, or changes in practice. We determine any current or programmatic operational impacts. We highlight financial and technological needs and identify stakeholders both internal and external. We also determine the security level of the document. The level of the policy may be determined by operational impacts, security needs, or other identified impacts which require the information to maintain its confidentiality. We also identify forms needed to support the policy. We consider procedures and guidance documents needed to support the policy as well. You're probably wondering what the difference is between the policy and guidance documents. It's an odd term. Policy in Vermont are directives. These identify the Department of Corrections' general principles, philosophy, goals, and mission towards a specific subject matter. These documents identify the Department of Corrections' approach, but do not necessarily provide direction on how staff can achieve it. Guidance documents, on the other hand, identify specific procedures and steps to achieve the policy. They are the how-to guides for our staff. These documents are designed so that new staff can read them and understand the majority of their job functions. The creation of the policy and guidance document system was a significant shift in the policy development process. Previously, Vermont Department of Corrections had singular documents that identified both principles and procedures. These historic documents were hard to edit, confusing to read, and constantly becoming outdated. The creation of the guidance and the policy system allows for procedures to be modified without changing the overall policy. It creates consistency with the way that the department writes procedure, and it outlines clear expectations for staff. So that's just step 1. Moving on to step 2, this is the drafting phase of the policy. Once a concept has been approved, the next stage is to begin collaboratively drafting the policy and any other necessary guidance documents. Typical drafting of a policy document in Vermont entails a policy analyst working closely with identified subject matter experts to come up with an initial draft. In forming this initial draft, the policy analyst will look at current policy, research and best practice, identified areas needing improvement, and processes or systematic gaps that currently exist. In the drafting process, Vermont engages line staff to gain an understanding of common practices, factors that impede performance or effectiveness, and any other recommendations. This engagement often includes site visits, where the policy analyst meets with line staff to see the current process in practice. Once an initial draft is created, key steps that follow include circulating the draft to the internal identified stakeholder group. The internal identified stakeholder group then utilizes an electronic comment form to provide line-by-line feedback. The policy analysts and subject matter experts then review the feedback, respond to feedback, and incorporate it when appropriate. The policy analyst clearly articulates the reasoning behind the decision whether or not to incorporate feedback. This encourages staff buy-in and engagement with the process. The policy analyst ensures that any staff members who provide a comment receive a response to their comment to emphasize the importance of their contribution. Responses are emailed directly back to this internal stakeholder group, thus closing the feedback loop. Finally, the draft is updated based on feedback, sent for legal review and executive approval, and then we hit step 3, the public and staff comment phase. Upon approval by legal and the executive leadership team, the draft is posted for a 2-week public comment period and sent via email to all internal staff for review. Vermont has learned that when sending a document for staff to review, it is imperative that the email highlights any key elements of the policy as well as any other statutory or legal obligations. This helps staff familiarize themselves with the policy while also creating a link between the policy and its impact to their daily job functions. Key steps to this phase include identifying and notifying any external stakeholders of their opportunity to provide comments, sending a union notification. This allows the department to become aware of any union implications as well as any unforeseen implementation or operational obstacles, and to close the comment period after 2 weeks, compile all the comments, review those comments, and then incorporate them as appropriate. The policy analyst with the subject matter experts responds to every comment received. These responses are then made available on the DOC's website. The policy analyst, based on the feedback, creates final versions of the draft for approval. Our final phase of the policy development process takes various amounts of time. In finalizing the policy, the first step is to conduct a policy development unit review. This review involves all the DOC's policy analysts looking over the nearly final documents to identify crossover and consistency issues. This review helps to ensure that all DOC documents work together and create a cohesive structure for the Department of Corrections policy. Once the unit review is completed, the policy and any other accompanying documents are sent for a final legal review and executive approval. To expedite the final legal review, the policy analysts highlight changes from the last legal review and emphasize areas of concern. Other key steps of this final phase include signature, dissemination of the policy to staff, and posting on the public website. We make all guidance documents and forms available to staff, perform implementation tasks such as training and software developments and updates. Note that this involves other areas and divisions outside of the policy development unit and takes cross-division collaboration. We also build in mechanisms for review and ongoing evaluation. Now that's the basics to our policy development process. The final part of this webinar will focus on an in-practice example of how Vermont used the policy development process to draft and implement the case management directive. But before we can really understand how we implemented the policy development process in the case management directive, we first must understand the vastness of Vermont's case management directive. The Vermont Department of Corrections Case Management Directive provides a summary of the department's philosophy, policy, and general principles surrounding case planning and management. In addition, it provides step-by-step procedures for staff to operationalize the principles of the directives, which tie together evidence-based research and corrections best practice. The directive principally walks its reader through case management from intake into a correctional facility through discharge from community supervision. The Case Management Directive and its corresponding guidance documents cover 10 specific areas. The first is facility case management. This section identifies procedures surrounding admission and intake into a correctional facility. It identifies monitoring, review, and contact requirements for facility caseworkers. What does this look like in real life? This is where the facility caseworker sits down with the offender and discusses their case plan at the facility. It also discusses things like visitor logs, phone calls, as well as how often they're going to meet, and other impacts to their time while they're serving in an incarcerative setting. The second section identifies the purpose of case planning and runs through the format of a case plan. It identifies which offenders require a case plan and the elements of a case plan. This was one of the larger policy shifts for Vermont, in that it clearly identifies the standards for writing a case plan, which includes a problem statement, goal statement, objectives, and interventions. What's unique about this section for Vermont is it identifies obligations for both the offender as well as obligations for the caseworker. It serves as a roadmap to bring the offender from incarceration through successful community supervision with the hope of eventual discharge. The next section encompasses specific procedural requirements for transition and reentry. It highlights the importance of a transition and reentry case plan for success in the community. This plan includes supports such as economic benefits, health insurance, housing, developmental services, education and employment, and transportation. It also clearly identifies the role of the facility caseworker and the role of the probation officer in the transition process. This clarified for staff what their roles and responsibilities were during this transition and reentry period, which had previously been largely muddled. The fourth, fifth, and sixth sections discuss community supervision. The first part discusses intake procedures, as well as identifies Vermont's general philosophy towards community supervision. The second part, risk management supervision, is Vermont's higher level of community supervision. In this area, we talk about contact standards, as well as risk control and risk reduction strategies, which are based on the offender's risk assessments and convictions. The third section within the community supervision section discusses the lower level of Vermont community supervision called response supervision. This too deals with contact standards as well as basic requirements, but does not require a case planning component. Additionally, there are sections on contact notes to create uniformity across the system. This section for you might be called case notes. We have contact notes based on a shift of our database. The contact notes create uniformity, and part of the directive's goal was to identify when you needed to write a note down versus when that note should be in a case plan or another area of the offender's file. The additional section on risk assessments identifies and summarizes all available risk assessments tools which the Department of Corrections utilizes. While not all these risk assessments are utilized or performed by the caseworker, by having them available for case management purposes, the caseworker is able to understand the entire breadth of risk assessments available to the department and how they may impact the offender's supervision. The final two sections are very unique to Vermont. The first is case staffing. A case staffing is used to make determinations about a case on an individual basis. It's effectively a case-by-case review conducted by a multidisciplinary team together to make determinations which are outside of normal policy. The final section integrates the Victim Services Unit and victim notification requirements into case management. It identifies the role of the facility caseworker and the probation officer in victim notification. This section is grounded by statutory obligations to perform notification at specific times. So how did we use the policy development process to create the case management directive? We used our four main phases. Now that you understand just how vast this directive is, let's go through these phases in detail. Phase one, identification and concept approval. The new case management directive encompasses 10 historic policy documents. In the identification of the and concept approval phase, Vermont recognized the interplay between these 10 documents and the need to create a single policy that outlines case management and case planning practices in the department. Other key elements of this initial phase included the identification of significant stakeholders, including all facility caseworkers as well as probation and parole officers and their corresponding supervisors. We also recognize the competing interests between casework and security staff. In Vermont, the Department of Corrections is unique and is housed under the Agency of Human Services. This gives us a bit of a different approach than just the pure security and containment mentality. The case management directive emphasizes this approach. We also recognize limited resources and the desire to answer staff's requests for a casework manual. Phase two is the drafting phase. For case management, we recognize that research suggests creating mechanisms for internal and external stakeholder feedback is critical to promoting long-term sustainability of practices. The drafting phase of case management identified policy and practice gaps in the transition and reentry section. Recognizing that current practice was not meeting the needs of staff or people reentering the community, the Policy Development Unit held a day-long stakeholder retreat in which we were able to map the transition and reentry sections, identify current processes, and identify what was working and not working by bringing in casework staff, their supervisors, as well as a multidisciplinary team. In addition to the drafting phase, we also highlighted the need for formal casework training. The Policy Development Unit began working and collaborating with other department divisions, as well as the Director of Casework, to ensure that training would take place upon finalization and implementation of the policy. The third phase for case management is the public and staff comment period. During the public and staff comment period phase, over 500 comments were collected. Just to emphasize, over 500 comments were collected. These comments highlighted the value of the case management directive, providing clear procedures and identified staff roles. It also emphasized that the directive represented a major cultural shift for the Department of Corrections. To address the concerns that came out of this comment period, the department revised its implementation strategy to include a day-long training for casework staff, highlighting the concerns that were raised during the comment period and educating on evidence-based practices that grounded the directive. The final phase of drafting the case management directive using the policy development process is the finalization phase. To finalize the directive, there was significant time between signature and the effective date to account for implementation. Implementation included the training components in which we selected staff to become trainers, and they then delivered the training to their peers in a T-for-T model. We also created an FAQ page that was designed so that staff could submit questions and receive responses regarding procedures and implementation. This is an ongoing implementation measure. The FAQ page is still up and running, and staff can still feel free to submit their comments and receive a response based on any questions that they might have from implementation, training, the directive, or the guidance documents themselves. We also implemented with corrections leadership coaching sessions with casework staff at regular intervals. These sessions are designed to address staff barriers with new practices and provide support in skill development. We additionally had numerous technical implementation mechanisms that had to be achieved, thus resulting in software updates, electronic forms, and other technological impacts that had to go live at the same time that the directive would become effective. This walks you through Vermont's in-practice example of policy development process as it relates to the case management directive. So what's next for Vermont? Are we done? Have we created this process? Are we going to change it? Where are we at? Vermont is constantly innovating and trying to modify and make its practices better. One of those modifications includes the creation of a SharePoint site. The Policy Development Unit has been working with the Agency of Human Services Information Technology Division to create a policy development SharePoint site. This site was completed in March of 2017. It allows for collaboration on in-progress policy development documents to promote editing and commenting within developing documents. This site also allows staff who have submitted feedback to check the status of their feedback as well as the department's response. Finally, the site will incorporate the current policy development intranet site and be a one-stop shop for directives, guidance, and forms. The Policy Development Unit is currently identifying an action plan on how to best launch the site to staff and utilize this new functionality. These goals are to create an easier ability for staff to provide comments on the policy drafts themselves and to have faster responses for staff feedback. One of the great aspects of this site is that staff will actually be able to log into the site, see the comment they submitted, and understand, is it in consideration? Have they reviewed it? What's the response? It will be in real time. As previously discussed in Step 4, the Policy Development Unit is now conducting unit reviews on each policy document, both before public comment and prior to signature. These reviews ensure that policies are released with a singular voice, imperative to ensure consistency across the department and to ensure that policies come out with the same type of language, the same definitions, and overall emphasize the same points. The other goal of this is to ensure that there are no conflicts with individual documents. Currently, Vermont has 3 policy analysts, each working on separate policy documents. By conducting unit reviews, we look to see what procedures are being written and whether or not those procedures both could have a conflict with current documents, also could have a conflict with anything in draft, or could have a conflict with things that we're going to be drafting or revising in the future. Things that are identified can then be noted so that when drafting begins or a review process entails, we can work together to ensure that we're creating consistent policies across the department. We also review to make sure that we're meeting the needs of other existing policies. Another area of consistent evolution is the targeted legal reviews. The Policy Development Unit clarified the role of legal reviews, which is to highlight areas of legal concern, and that staff comment is the opportunity to place opinions and stylistic edits. This has made our legal reviews quicker and less burdensome for all staff involved. This is also an area that used to take significant amount of time and was one of the areas that created sometimes years and years of policies being developed in the process. Finally, as part of the statewide recidivism reduction grant, the policy workstream incorporates evaluations. One of the Policy Development Unit's main goals during the 3-year grant is to increase staff involvement during the drafting and review of directives. Staff involvement in the drafting of a policy can lead to an easier transition when the policy becomes effective. To determine the current level of staff involvement and measure how staff feel about their involvement, the Policy Development Unit began administering quarterly surveys using SurveyMonkey. These surveys are sent to all department staff and contain specific questions for the previous quarter's policies. The surveys are used as a tool to assess whether the Policy Development Unit is garnering more staff involvement and whether staff feel included in the policy development process. The evaluators for the grant then provide an analysis to the data, which then informs the decisions and adjustments are made as needed to the policy development process. That's a good overview of what we've done, what our problems were, and where policy development currently stands in Vermont. We welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Connie. And yeah, before we wrap up, we'd like to give you all an opportunity to ask your questions for the panelists. So please feel free to type them into the Q&A box on your screen. Okay. Sarah, what staff were identified to conduct the coaching sessions for caseworkers? Was it supervisors or a training team?
So how that worked is that the Director of Casework and the Director of Victim Services went out to each site and they conducted coaching sessions, and in addition, they also brought along trainers who had been trained using the T for T model. So one of the areas where this was most important was the victim notification section. Historically in Vermont, victim notification had been done by the Victim Services Unit. The Case Management Directive made a shift to this historic policy, and now victim notification is provided primarily by casework staff, both in the field and in the facility. Recognizing what a significant shift this was, part of which came out from public comment, there were coaching sessions which specifically dealt with victim notification, the statutory timelines, as well as guiding casework staff and probation and parole officers on how to conduct victim notification. They're not always used to talking with victims and dealing with very sensitive issues. So these coaching sessions allowed our Director of Victim Services to work with the staff to really understand where there were gaps, provide additional information. The Director of Casework's coaching sessions really focused on the case planning aspect of case management and moving towards the model of this problem statement, goal statement, objectives, and interventions. And in addition, having the trainers there at their respective site also gave an opportunity for them to teach their peers again. One of the great things about that particular implementation mechanism was that the trainers were either caseworkers themselves or supervisors. So they were both providing the training to the entire casework staff here in Vermont, but they were doing it on a peer-to-peer relationship.
Thank you. This question can be for Sarah or for Connie. Do you feel that staff abused the surveys as an opportunity to complain, or was there a lot of valuable and insight gleaned from the surveys?
Honestly, I would never think of any comment as an abuse. My approach is that we don't have to like it, but we have to hear it and we have to deal with it. And my sense was that we adjusted the survey quite a bit between the first quarters and the second quarters round because we understood better where people were coming from, and we have seen a significant increase in people's sense of their ability to participate. And they began to understand the process by which we ask them better. I don't know what you think, Sarah.
No, I would say it was really an outlet for staff to be able to provide honest and anonymous feedback. We've gotten some wonderful feedback from the survey that I don't think we would get necessarily if we just asked face-to-face or if we asked via email. This gave staff a real opportunity to voice both the things that they really liked about policy development and specifically to specific directives, as well as identified areas that, you know, they were struggling with or that they needed assistance with. And that can then both help inform policy development as a process, but can also be really valuable for us to be able to give executive leadership here to help guide some of those cultural shifts and identify how staff are feeling. So I don't think there was any concern of abuse.
I think also, this is Connie, there is a small subset of people who will find fault with anything and everything we do. And I think it's important to hear that and to acknowledge that and then to give it the proper weight in the overall picture.
Thanks, Connie. That makes a lot of sense, yeah. Moving on to another question. Who could I contact to learn more about your SharePoint application?
You can certainly address those comments and questions to me, and I'm happy to try and either answer them the best I can or field those questions to further people who might be better equipped. One of the cool things about the SharePoint application is that we really customized that site for policy development and incorporated a comment sheet that is based off of what our historic electronic comment sheet is based off of. So we used to have this Excel document where people entered in the page number, the line number, their comment, and which document they were commenting on. With the new functionality of SharePoint, it's now actually almost like an electronic form, and then it flows into a list, which we can then export into Excel.
Excellent, thank you. And I just skipped ahead to the slide that has your contact information on it for folks. We have a couple more questions here. Can you give an example of a policy and a corresponding guidance note? I'm interested in knowing how they complement each other and the level of detail in each.
Sure. So a recent policy that we have worked on here in Vermont is investigations. And part of our investigations policy encompasses the Prison Rape Elimination Act requirements. Now, obviously, we have a policy which goes into the different types of investigations. It speaks generally about how we approach them, the department's philosophy, goals, principles, our mission. That directive is very complex because it involves a lot of different players. We had meetings that involved both DOC staff as well as state's attorney staff, investigative staff. We had the Vermont State Police present. And by working together, we were able to really collaborate on the procedures themselves. Now, those procedures get into great amounts of detail. So our policy identifies our general approach, and then our procedure will identify exactly who you need to contact, which office you need to contact, and the specifics of for each kind of nitty-gritty detail, which is so imperative when dealing with that type and that complexity of subject matter.
Great, thank you. We have a question here from someone in Delaware, and they're interested in knowing if a department has a contracted provider for all services. And do you recommend that the provider be involved in the policy development, or do you recommend that they be part of the public comment phase?
Just to understand your question, so they're asking when they have contracted staff, whether or not the contracted staff who are not state employees should be involved with the policy development process? Is that kind of a good rephrase?
I think that's accurate, yeah.
Okay, so we have contract staff here in Vermont as well, and they do often engage in policy development. If it specifically targets the contract staff, they are often involved early on in our internal stakeholder feedback, which we call our policy development team. But we also have many of our partners and our contractors comment during public and staff comments. So I think it's two parts. I think if the policy directly relates to their subject matter, then obviously incorporating them as early into the process will allow you to collaborate and work effectively and make sure that everyone's time is used as most efficiently as possible. However, we often get our contractor staff who comment on public comments just on our policies in general because they want to know what we as the department are doing. They want to understand the other areas. So when we were drafting case management, we actually had some comments that came in from some of our partners that related to our program with women who work with women and their children. And even though it didn't have a direct tie into that program, they were really interested to understand what we were doing and how that overall was going to be implemented as a department. So I think depending on your approach, you know, both can be really valuable.
And I believe, Sarah, when we have the public comment period, the policies are published on the public-facing department website, but there's also a list of people that get alerted that is put together by us, yes, thinking about who might potentially be either impacted by the new policy or particularly invested in its execution.
Absolutely, and that is so imperative when we're dealing with policies that have, you know, big impacts on the community, or we really want to get specific feedback from certain advocacy groups. We recently wrote a policy that is built off of the NIC's practices for gender responsivity. We were able to highlight that policy to some external advocacy groups and stakeholders and really understand where they were coming from and see what advice they had for us. And it was such a great collaborative process to be able to work, to have them provide feedback and for us to be able to kind of work together.
Great, and this question kind of piggybacks off of that, about how did you identify the external stakeholders and who specifically were they?
External stakeholders are always identified primarily by the subject matter experts. So for us, that's each policy in the Vermont Department of Corrections has an owner, and the owner is whichever senior executive staff the policy would fall under. So for example, case management falls under the director of casework. Investigations falls under our director of facility operations. Each policy is associated with a specific director. Those directors really know who the external stakeholders are. They're always working with them. They're collaborating, but they're able to give us as the policy analysts lists of people that we should reach out to. Additionally, when we're working on an administrative rule, for example, we often will get given external stakeholders through our rulemaking process. So it's kind of a two-part. One, we have our internal process for identification, which largely is done by our executive staff, and then if it's something that we're doing rulemaking on, then those are often identified for us.
Great. Thank you. And we have a last question here. Now that staff are doing the victim notification, are those staff trained in any type of safety planning, and do they have access to referrals for community programs that provide victim assistance?
They absolutely do. So how that process works for victim notification is that casework staff and probation and parole officers conduct the statutory notification, which means that they will say this person is scheduled to be released on April 30th. They consult and can refer cases to our victim services staff, who can provide much more detailed information, as well as do community referrals, can link victims with community providers, can provide additional resources. So the role of the casework staff and the probation officer is really to meet that statutory obligation, which is set at specific time periods. So they're being released or they've been returned to custody, and it's to provide that that type of notification, then we also have our own victim services unit, which is within the Department of Corrections, as well as community providers who can provide things like safety planning and additional resources as needed. We did, however, provide our casework and probation and parole staff with links to those resources so that they were aware of them, and part of the coaching session emphasized those parts so that they were more aware of what was available in their specific communities.
Great, thanks, Sarah. It seems like that is the last of the questions, and I just wanted to give everybody a reminder that the slides and the full presentation will be available on our website. And if you registered for this webinar, you will receive an email notification once that happens. If there aren't any other further questions, I wanted to just say thank you to all of our panelists and thank you to everybody that participated in the webinar.
Andrea, thank you so much for giving us a chance to showcase Vermont's work. And I am really grateful to be able to share what we have come up with. To me, in those grants, it's one of the most valuable experiences to establish a collaborative learning community so we don't each have to stumble around in the dark doing it all by ourselves. So I very much welcome the chance that we were given. And if you need anything else from us, we would love to do it again.
Excellent. Thank you, Connie. And you'll see Sarah and Connie's email there on the last slide of the PowerPoint. So feel free to contact them with any further questions. All right, thank you, everybody.